From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
This is Outlook, a reflection of our place, our time, and our people.
This is precious angel that got laid down like an animal. She didn't deserve to die.
Welcome to Outlook. I'm Beth Voorhees. Given the violent history between Alicia Gravely and Desmond Clark, it seems it could have been easy to predict that he would kill her someday. Charleston police say he finally did last Saturday afternoon. She was shot several times, first in his vehicle, then at this Taco Bell restaurant. In this surveillance video, police say that's Desmond Clark sliding over a counter in pursuit of Alicia Gravely. They say he found her in a utility closet, shot her 5 to 6 times, then calmly left the restaurant. Clark was arrested early Sunday morning, just after midnight.
Do you have anything you want to say to her family?
I love my son.
What does it mean for him now?
We're going to catch who did it.
It wasn't you?
Nope. I know you want to hold these Jordans because those New Balances ain't doing it.
In the past 4 years, Clark has been arrested several times. Once he allegedly grazed her with a bullet. He's also been arrested on charges of stabbing, beating, and kidnapping Gravely. But he's only served about 3 months in jail. Once, charges were dropped because a police officer failed to attend a hearing. In 2005, prosecutors never brought to a grand jury charges that he kidnapped Gravely and hit her in the head with a handgun. This past March, he was sentenced to just 2 years probation on drug, weapons, and battery charges. He wasn't sentenced to any jail time. He entered a plea bargain to these charges in January, just a month after Clark himself was a shooting victim in Charleston. Still, why was a man with such a long arrest record allowed to remain on the streets? Earlier this week, reporter Scott Finn gauged sentiment in the community where the shooting took place. He spoke to Pastor Matthew Watts, who heads a community development program in the area. Desmond Clark was once enrolled in that program.
I can only speak from my personal dealings with him. Okay, with me, he was always respectful. So he was in our GED program, he was respectful to me. I would see him on the street, and I would talk to him, respectful. The last time I spoke with him was at Shawnee Park, and he had played a basketball game. And I said to him, God has given you another chance, because after him recovering from being shot back in December, and what are you going to do with that chance?
What did he say?
Well, he told me he was going to take advantage of it.
See, we've got to stop having leniency for people who do domestic battery and domestic violence. They need to be treated like any other hardened criminal because they have the capacity to kill. And not just maim, but to kill and destroy whole families.
Saturday's pursuit of Desmond Clark led SWAT team officers to this street, where some friends of Clark's are upset with Pastor Watts.
I know, but why are y'all doing an interview here?
We've been walking around the whole community. If you want to talk to us, be more willing to interview you all if you'd like to.
No, I'd rather not. And Reverend Watts, I think you should have blessed everyone, not just one family this weekend.
Well, if you would call me, we'd talk about it, and I'll be more than glad to explain to you what my position is.
No, I'd rather not talk about it.
Well, you call.
I'm just saying you should have blessed everyone's family. It's more than one family hurt in this situation.
I understand that.
It's not just one family.
I understand
Everybody's
that.
hurt.
I understand that. You talk to Miss Clark, and I think that she was. That's what I deal with in this community. It rips at the community, and so long after this moves off of the front page of the newspaper, and long after it's no longer on PBS and the network news, the community often is still hemorrhaging over what has happened.
Joining us now is Pastor Matthew Watts. He heads a program for at-risk youth and juvenile offenders called Hope Community Development. He's joining us for a larger discussion of the criminal justice system, from domestic violence laws to how and why deals are made that keep people like Desmond Clark on the street. We're also joined by George Castell. He's the Chief Public Defender in Kanawha County. Charleston Police Chief Brent Webster, and Delegate Carrie Webster, the chairwoman of the House Judiciary Committee. Delegate Webster has been working to strengthen domestic violence laws, and for purposes of disclosure, we would like to say that Delegate Webster and Chief Webster are brother and sister. Welcome to you all. Glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pastor Watts, explain what we just saw. What was that woman talking to you about?
Well, it's a frustrated, concerned citizen. She felt that I should have shown more attention to the family of the alleged perpetrator of this recent shooting on the West Side during my Sunday morning radio program, when I did focus a considerable amount of attention to the family of the deceased young lady, which I believe to be appropriate for me to do. We always dedicate programs and we show attention to families of the bereaved. But it shows concern and it shows frustration. She is a very close friend and dear friend of the mother of the alleged perpetrator, and more like an aunt to him. And she's concerned and she's frustrated. And because I don't hide from the people, nor do I hide from their criticism, I'm accountable to the people, their frustration will be vented against someone like myself, because they often cannot vent their frustration to the people that they're really upset with.
Chief Webster, there has been a lot of discussion about the multiple arrests of Desmond Clark. Obviously, your officers knew this guy, right?
Yes.
Were they frustrated that he was still on the street?
Yes, they were very frustrated. He's not the only one. When you see repeat offenders, you do get frustrated, and you wish maybe you could do more. But we also understand the limitations of the system as well. And there's a lot of if-onlys. You know, if only we had more evidence, if only we showed up to court and testified, those kind of things. And so, but we were very, very aware of him, and we knew of him.
Mr. Castell, in very general terms, now you've never represented Desmond Clark.
Not personally,
Not
no.
personally. But in general terms, from a defender who deals with young men like this all the time,
yes.
Why was he not in jail?
What I usually see is just the opposite. I see not vast numbers of people who aren't in jail, who the general public and the general consensus should be in jail. I see just the opposite. I see large numbers of people in jail, I think unnecessarily and inappropriately. So my experience is primarily the opposite. And I think if you look historically, and of course any one tragedy or any one major crime draws a lot of attention, but it sometimes, in fact it often, gives a distorted impression, because if you look at the historical record just in West Virginia, you see over the last 15 years or so, you see a population that is stable. You see a crime rate that is not increasing, but is instead declining, including a violent crime rate declining. And yet you see a jail and prison population that honestly has tripled. Tripled when every factor that you would think would have a bearing on the size of the prison population has decreased.
Delegate Webster, your background is as a public defender. You represent this area of Charleston in the legislature, and you're chair of the Judiciary Committee. What stands out to you about this case, maybe not this case specifically, but this scenario, which plays out time and time again in West Virginia? Just a couple of months ago, a woman bus driver shot cleaning her bus by her estranged husband. We see this scenario played out. So from your perspective, what should be done?
Well, one thing that I think is evident just from the discussion at this table is a lack of information. We're focusing on the conviction and sentencing afterwards, but a part that we're working on in the legislature is a uniform bond schedule that will at least give guidance, because you're supposed, when you look at a person who's a candidate for bond, in almost every crime except a capital one, you're going to look at likelihood to commit a crime, their past record, their willingness to show up in court, because that's the point of bail. And one thing, and this is something the public didn't know, did we have low bonds? You know, those kinds of issues.
He could met the bonds.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think, you know, the records show that he was in all total, you know, between 40, 60, 70 days on different charges. But violent crimes usually mean higher bonds. And the criteria a magistrate will look at will be your prior arrest record, your likelihood of committing another one, and violence. Are you likely to commit it again?
And in West Virginia, the bonds are too low.
The bonds are arbitrary. There's
they're arbitrary.
no schedule.
Well, I think the problem is just the opposite, that with individual exceptions that we can all criticize, that bonds are much higher than they have ever been in the past, This is pretrial incarceration when, as Reverend Watts points out, there's a presumption of innocence that when a bond is so high that a person can't post it, that's in effect a presumption of guilt, and it's serving punishment before conviction. So we have jails filled with people who shouldn't be there because bonds are in my experience, often set much too high.
Chief Webster, when there's a situation where you have a person who is habitual criminal and not incarcerated, who can you go to talk to about this? Who can you go to and say, look, we've got this young man, we know he's ready to explode, something's going to happen, and we've got to do something about him, but we don't have, can you talk to him? Can you talk to the public defender's office? Who do you talk to?
It usually wouldn't be the public defender's office, just the way we're structured. I mean, it could be, but it usually wouldn't be. It might be Reverend Watts, it might be someone in the community. I know that's something that we've talked about over the last couple of years, that you're looking for some programs through the court system to help out with that. People like Reverend Watts are in positions, you counsel these guys, and you can predict, he can predict it, a lot of it. He can tell us, but that's very frustrating because we don't always know. You can see it kind of unwinding. You can kind of see this person slipping, but a lot of times it's too late once it happens.
How's your relationship? How's your relationship?
We have a great relationship. I mean, I have great respect for him because he's accessible. You call him, he calls you back. You have a problem, he shows up. And I think that that's a good thing. And even we don't always agree, we always agree we're going to talk about it. And we leave, we've got a good understanding where each person stands. I think the Chief makes an excellent point that what we got to decide is how we're going to approach this. A horrific crisis like this can bring attention. And the question is whether or not we use this as a way to interrogate our system. Now, if we're just going to be defensive and basically say we got the best system in the world and it can't be improved, but if we go back and take a look at every phase and every step to say, could we have done something differently? It doesn't mean that it would have been a different outcome. It just means that we take this as an opportunity to improve the system. So hopefully next time it will serve us better. An issue we got to deal with is the root cause here. You've got a serious substance abuse problem in this country. It is the #1 pathology that's destroying this country. It is a driver behind much of the crime we see, particularly violent crime. You have a situation we don't want to talk about, the depression, the discouragement among these young people. They're self-medicating with drugs. They're mixing prescription drugs with illegal drugs and with alcohol, and they're lethal time bombs ready to explode. And we're not responding with substance abuse mental health treatment for this population of people. And until we do that, we will revisit this.
How much do you work with the public defender's office or the prosecution? Are you in touch?
Sure. I mean, we work very closely with the public defender's office because normally the juveniles in particular that we work with are represented by a public defender. And there are times that we work with the prosecutor's office as well when we feel like, look, you know, we don't have a conflict of interest, but there are times that there's a person that we think this person needs aggressive prosecution. We know things in the community that the people making the decisions in the court after people have come through the metal detector, they don't know. We see people in real time, in real situations, and we know relationships that are volatile in the community that some people don't know about. And so we have
Mr. Gattel, you were nodding your head there.
I agree with much of what Reverend Watts has to say. I need to add a few things. And one is that we have a good criminal justice system in this state. What we need to do is recognize that this is a good system, this is a good city and a good state with a low crime rate, not a high one, with a domestic violence rate that is decreasing, not increasing. And yet when you have these individual examples, we can do better.
And you've made those points, but I guess I have to ask you and Chief Webster, how many more Desmond Clarks are out there?
Well, I think we probably all can answer that. I know probably Reverend Watts from some
of that's true.
I mean, there's more. And then you know what? They might be 10 years away from being the next Desmond Clark, and that's the trick here, is trying to figure out who those people are. But we've talked about before that sometimes the system empowers these young men and women, but and maybe possibly in Desmond's case, maybe not. Maybe the fact that he did have those arrests and he never did spend any real time. I mean, I don't want to put words in Reverend Watts, but I know I feel this way, that maybe he got empowered a little bit by the system. I can keep getting away with this kid. I don't know. and it does seem like, particularly in juvenile system, it seems like there's a lot of empowerment because there's not real. We don't feel in law enforcement there's any real consequences.
Are there guys out there committing serious crimes and not doing time for it because the defense is real good at convincing a judge not to?
Oh, I don't think so.
No.
The experiences that I have in court, and I hate to continue to seem so contrary, but the experiences that I have in court are much more frequently the opposite, where we present a compelling case for treatment and rehabilitation rather than harsh punishment. The judge imposes harsh punishment. That's why we have a jail and prison rate that is 3 times higher than it was 15 years ago. I mean, 3 times as many people are in custody today in a state that has not grown in population. And I think one of the reasons we're here today is because these kind of cases that we're talking about are so newsworthy because they're rare. Not that they're commonplace.
That's a good point.
They're rare, and we're here today, and we should recognize that. Not that it isn't.
And we want to make sure they stay rare.
Exactly, and become even rarer.
I would slightly beg to differ there. I mean, a crime this horrific may be rare, but we have shootings in this city. And in recent years, I mean, we've had a number of murders that take place.
Last time you and I talked was some young men were shot in Charleston.
Yeah, but here's what I would say.
Not becoming quite so rare.
I would agree. I would agree with George. And when you look at the adult system, I think that there are times that we're mad at people and we're angry with them. And sometimes the reason we're mad and angry and frustrated is because they've been through the juvenile system. And so we're quick to pull the trigger. And I would agree. I think we're locking some people up that shouldn't be locked up, nonviolent people. We're giving ridiculously high sentences with some of this drug stuff and so forth. My concern, and where we might have a slight departure, is that I'm concerned about our juvenile justice system. Because as Chief said earlier, I do believe in times it emboldens these young people. Because what we don't do is that we don't bring the consequences and the help. And I'm not suggesting that we lock them all up. I'm one for only locking up the person that needs to be locked up. But what I'm saying is we do nothing. And very often we send most of them home with their parents. They conclude that the juvenile justice system and the criminal justice system is an absolute joke. And they go through this for a number of years. And then they graduate at 18 and now they're in the adult system. And one day, with the passage of a birthday, the way they're treated totally changes.
Let me get back to Chief Webster. What's your relationship with the prosecutor's office? There is some question here. I guess an officer didn't show up for a hearing from Clark.
Well, that wouldn't have much to do with our relationship. That might be. We're researching why the officer missed, and we are researching that. And it could be he didn't get a subpoena. It could be. I mean, it could be no fault of his own, or it could. But then again, it could be his fault. And that's what. And there's probably going to be discipline if we can. We're researching that because one's a year and a half ago. And one's 2 years ago. So
is the police department consulted on plea deals between defense attorneys and prosecutors?
We are. It's ultimately the prosecutor's, call. But if the investigator or the officer, if they need to aim to be a shareholder and get in there and make sure their case is heard. My experience has been when I was working cases is that on major cases they will ask you.
Okay.
They will, and these are some major cases we're talking about. But it's ultimately their decision, and sometimes officers get very upset. It's probably as the public offenders may know. Sometimes they don't like the deals that are given, but I think as officers get older and seasoned, they end up moving right in the middle and understanding exactly what these gentlemen are saying. Is that I want the right people in jail. Right. As a police officer, I don't want everybody to go to jail, and so our officers start realizing that, and they want the violent criminals in jail too.
Here's our frustration. Frustration is the way the system works. You plead a case. The public didn't hear the evidence. The public didn't serve on the jury. The probation officer then does a pre-sentencing report. They got a process they go through, and they'll get a stock of letters from a lot of people that know and like this person. But there's very little input from the public in terms of what the public really thinks. So there's little perspective from what happens. And so this process will move forward to the pre-sentence report, to the judge, the police. Of course, I think they're trying to represent the public's interest, the prosecutor, but the thing is pleaded, so it is what it is. So then you're left to interpret what you see. So what you see is a person that that's potentially violent and you think should be locked up. and they get released back to the community, and you simply don't understand that. So then what happens is the people then start to conjure up things. And they say, well, they must be a confidential informant.
Yeah, I was going to
You
bring
see?
that up.
And that's why this morning I said, no, I don't believe that this young man was a confidential informant. Why? Because Brent Webster said that he wasn't. That's good enough for me. But in the minds of the people, they can't figure this out because they know certain individuals in the community. That's why it's important for those who are the custodians of the court to really understand the court doesn't belong to them. The court belongs to the people. And so they have a responsibility to educate the people as much as they possibly can so the people can respect and trust their decision. Here's the crisis I see. We're losing confidence in law enforcement, we're losing confidence in the judicial system. And that's the worst situation you want to have, when you can't get people to come and testify, not because they're not concerned, but because they don't think that they can be protected by the court and by law enforcement, because they see bad people repeatedly released back to the community. This is a serious issue. So a lot of people run the court system don't understand that these kids now, young kids, middle school, high school age, are exchanging crack and marijuana for Xanaxes and other prescription drugs and mixing them together, and it's all in their state of mind. It's happening. You see, they need to understand that.
What about this notion, this confidential informant, this culture of, telling people what you know, working with the police officers. What's this all about, confidential informants? What's this all about?
Well, I mean, confidential informants for years, I mean, we have to use them because a lot of times police aren't allowed into a subculture of violence or drugs or whatever. I think, and of course I'm administrator these days, but I think that the guidelines to be a confidential informant have really tightened up. Maybe George can jump in, because I don't know what the prosecutor's office, I know that crimes of violence will pretty much knock you out. We don't want you.
Okay. Are they paid?
They can be paid. Now, some people just want to do it because they want to help. But confidential informants, see, the confidential informants that this article's talking about, we can't find a CI number on Desmond Clark. We can't find where there's ever been a payment.
So it's that formal.
It's a formal, right?
Bookwork.
Now it's formal. Now, if Desmond Clark, and I'm supposing here, if Desmond Clark at one time called up a police officer he knew and said, hey, I'll give you this information, will you help me? That's not, in my mind, a confidential informant that we have a book on, that maybe you guys go to court and eventually want to, give them a number and you guys want to find out their identity to testify in court. We have exhausted our files, and current commanders and former commanders, and those files do not exist. There's no one. Matter of fact, I said it this morning in an interview, when I called Sergeant Palmer over at Street Crimes Unit, he laughed, he said, well, he's one of our biggest targets. I mean, he's someone we've been trying to get off the streets forever. He said, I'm making my own conclusions from what I'm reading in the paper. If a police officer went into an arraignment proceeding and said, listen, he cooperated with me, he's courteous, and Your Honor, if you can give him a decent bond, I'd appreciate it. That to me does not make him a confidential informant. But now that's what the Daily Mail said today. The Daily Mail said that sources close to Clark said that they watched several officers ask for leniency to him. We don't have any proof of that.
And I think that the confusion is based on a misunderstanding, much as Chief Webster described, because there's actually two categories of informants. But what I should point out about the whole issue with confidential informants, it's a very sensitive one, because a person out on the street who's already in trouble and already involved in the system doesn't necessarily have the highest credibility in the first place. And if you offer somebody freedom in exchange for providing valuable information, a person with no information at all to provide would have an incentive to fabricate it. It's a tough situation for the whole court system to be in, because if there's valuable information that is necessary in order to achieve justice in a case, but the only person who might have that information isn't a very reliable person, we're all in a tricky category.
But we still do it.
Yeah.
And here's the problem with it. Now, I know Desmond Clark has been vilified, and he is what he is, and whatever he's done in his life, he's done that. I know him personally. And there's one thing that was very important to him, was his street credibility.
His street credibility?
His street credibility, and Desmond Clark is loyal to his community. So I don't think that he would sell himself to be a confidential informant. He also understands the street, and he knows what can happen to confidential informants. And this whole confidential informant thing, don't think that it doesn't contribute to the violence in the neighborhood and the community, because it creates this suspicion that you're a confidential informant and you sold this person out and you sold that person out. And some of these shootings has been associated with that, you see. And there are times when people have been shot that had nothing to do with something, but because someone thought someone was a confidential informant, then that happened. This war on drugs is contributing to the violence in the community about how we're choosing to prosecute the war on drugs. And in the federal system, the confidential informant is a very important part of the war on drugs. These are things that need to be discussed because no one talks about them out loud. But it's the reality of what happens in the neighborhood and in the street.
Chief Webster, what about his point that confidential informants are themselves threatening the peace of a community?
I agree with him, and that's why I think it also goes in line with what George says, that they're a delicate balance. And that's why I think that, and I hope and I pray that our officers, the reliability is important, the credibility is important. You've got to go out there and verify the information, and because you don't want to make up things to put people in jail. You don't want to make up because they have something to gain. And so I agree, and a lot of our shootings are retaliation shootings. And also today when this confidential informant story broke, a couple of our detectives, both black and white, said the same thing you just said. They said that I don't see Desmond being an informant. I just don't see it because of the because how he wants to be perceived in the community. So my advice would be, if the Gazette can get out there and see him, go out and ask him. Go out and I'm being facetious, but go out and ask him. I mean, maybe he'll tell them if he's an informant, because we just don't have any record of it.
And let me add just a footnote to this. The speculation, I think, has been fueled because you have a guy that at least had a pretty lengthy violent arrest record, namely, with the victim, but also had a plea that had resulted in probation and the prosecutor standing silent. And what I've learned, and I think this is a frustration that is going to create more problems in the system, is you have pre-sentence reports that result in a recommendation for probation or not. We don't know what Desmond Clark said in this particular case that was pled and sentenced, I guess, last year. But I've called the court today, the Supreme Court, to verify, and the rules and the statutes say they're confidential. I said, what about the recommendations? Could we not just get that? Because I don't think medical and psychological and all that is something the public needs to know, about somebody that may be sentenced. Well, I'm told there's case law that says even that's confidential. But I think generally, and not just specific to this case, that there are things that, particularly when we don't have jury trials, but the system still is owned and run and should be for the public. Those answers, I mean, really, we should know, because it was an open court proceeding, I'm sure, if he was not a juvenile, is what made the state decide the sentencing to remain silent. There was a reason for that. And so as a public office holder, I probably feel a little strongly about things that I maybe used to think should be confidential or understand the reasoning, and now maybe think that one of the things I'm going to look at is whether or not some of those things by statute or rule should be opened up so the public can glean from that the reasoning of our officials.
Delegate Kerry Webster, I'm going to give you the final word on that. George Castell, Chief Brent Webster, and Pastor Matthew Watch, thank you very much for a very interesting conversation, and I'm sure we'll be talking more about these issues as we go along. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
If you missed part of this discussion or just want to watch it again, you can go to our website. The address is wvpubcast.org. I'm Beth Voorhees. Good night.
Support for Outlook is provided by the following: the National Science Foundation's West Virginia Experimental Program to stimulate competitive research, investing in West Virginia's future by building infrastructure for scientific research, on the web at wvresearch.org.